Over the years, I have tried several different methods of bleeding brakes, so I'm going to go through some of the pros and cons of each of these methods and which ones I prefer. The two methods of bleeding brakes that I'm familiar with would be the auto one-man method or the two-man method, where you open and close the valve each time that you pump up pressure on the pedal and then release it. I use a combination of both methods. The one-man method to get a lot of fluid through, because I want to purge and clean and make sure that I have new fluid in the system. Then at the end, I use the two-man method just to make sure that I get all of the air out of the system. Years ago, when I would bleed brakes, I would use as little brake fluid as possible. But now, I make sure that I bleed as much fluid as I can because I want clear, clean fluid in the system at all times. It's not just the air that I'm trying to get out. I'm also trying to get out the old gunky fluid as well. Brake fluid is pretty inexpensive, and once you open it up, you want to use the entire container because while it sits on your shelf, it's going to pull in air, and you don't want to use that next time. Each time you work on your brake system, whenever you open up the system, you introduce air, and this is why you need to bleed this air out of the system. Well, let's go ahead and start the process of how I bleed brakes. First, put a wrench onto the bleeder screw, and we're going to use a one-man bleeding system, which is basically just a tube with a bottle with a magnet that goes all the way to the bottom to make sure each time you pump the brakes, air is not introduced into the system. Although I don't trust this system all the way, it's pretty good to get the job started. This bottle with the magnet's pretty fancy, but if you wanted to, you could take a tube, put it onto the bleeder nipple, and put it into a container. Just make sure the end of the tube in the container is below the fluid, so each time you pump the brakes, you're not going to introduce air into it. Because this system is not that expensive, I really like the magnet, because without it, it seems like it always gets kicked over and spills all over the floor. So this is nice and neat and clean. Although I like this one-man bleeding system because it gets lots of fluid through the system so I can get to the clean stuff faster, I have had air introduced by the bleeder screw itself. So at the end, that's why I use the two-man bleeding system for the final bleed to make sure I get the air out. Before you start bleeding the brakes, make sure the master cylinder is topped off because you don't want to run your fluid out of the master cylinder, because if you do, air is going to be introduced to the entire system. Then you have to bleed all four wheels. Most brake systems are DOT3. You want to make sure you get the right brake fluid, so you want to read it on the car. Make sure that it's DOT3. You don't want to take a chance on this. The reason it's important to get the right type of brake fluid in your car is some brake fluid will damage the seals if you put in the wrong stuff. So make sure you read what type and get the right type in. I like this smaller container because whenever it fills up and I pour it out, that reminds me to go put more fluid into the master cylinder to make sure I don't get the levels too low. I continue using the one-man bleeding system until the gunky fluid disappears. Notice I leave a little bit of the old fluid in the bottom to make sure that the end of the tube is completely covered to keep the air out. As I do the one-man bleeding system, I notice there's a lot less air, but because the fluid is still dirty, I'm going to continue until I see no air and new fluid come out. Some people do a brake fluid change. What I prefer to do is whenever I bleed the brakes, make sure that you get the junky stuff out. So it's kind of like you're getting a brake fluid change while you're bleeding your brakes. Now that I see fresh, clean fluid coming out, I completely pour the entire bottle out so I can watch and verify and make sure that I've got clean fluid going through the system. Now that I have the clean fluid, I'm going to switch over to the two-man bleeding brake system just to make sure that I get all the air out. Now I'm going to start the process of the two-man bleeding system. And basically the way this works is you get one person to get into the driver's seat, and they are going to pump the brake until it's nice and stiff and hold it. While the one person is holding the brake, then the other person releases the bleeder screw until you feel the pressure release, then close the valve again. This is when the person in the driver's seat pumps it up again and holds the pressure. Once the pedal goes all the way to the floor, you want to close the valve, and this keeps the air from being reintroduced into the system. I know this is a bit tricky. Let me go through the process again so it's very clear. First, the person in the car pumps up the pedal until there's pressure. Then release the pressure. You'll feel it go to the floor. Close the valve, pump it back up with pressure. Release the valve. You'll feel it go down to the floor. Then go ahead and close the valve again. I know this two-man bleeding method is a tough concept to get your head around, but I have found that this does get all of the air out, and I wish that the one-man bleeding system worked to where I could feel comfortable with it, but because I've seen the valve itself leak and introduce air into the line, I just don't trust it. So basically, I continue this process watching this hose like a hawk until I don't see any air at all going through the system. When I don't see any air bubbles, not even the little air bubbles, then I know I'm done. Bleeding all the air out of the system is very important, because if you don't get all the air out, then your brakes will be spongy, and you don't want spongy brakes. So take your time with the process, make sure you get the air out. Now that you have bled your brakes properly, you can drive and stop with confidence. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.